and we're just going to continue. The very rich and everyone else. It would benefit a very small group of people who owned assets, and it would punish the very large group of people who lived on paychecks and tried to save money. Just as important, this tidal wave of money would encourage every entity on Wall Street to adopt riskier and riskier behavior in a world of cheap debt and heavy lending, potentially creating exactly the kind of ruinous financial bubble that had caused the global financial crisis in the first place. This is what Honig had been arguing inside the secret FOMIC meetings for months. His arguments growing sharper and more direct, punctuated by his dissenting votes. As it turned out, Honig was almost entirely correct in his concerns and his predictions. Perhaps no single government policy did more to reshape American economic life than the policy the Fed began to execute on that November day. And no single policy did more to widen the divide between the rich and the poor. Understanding what the Fed did in November 2010 is the key to understanding the very strange economic decade that followed. When asset prices soared, the stock market boomed, and the American middle class fell further behind. At first, when Honig started casting no votes, he was trying to convince his peers that they might take a different path. But this effort was undermined by the Fed's chairman, Ben Bernanke, who was Quantitative Easing's author. Bernanke was an academic who had joined the Fed in 2002 and became chairman in 2016. Bernanke led the response to the global financial crisis, which made him famous. He was anointed Time magazine's Person of the Year in 2009 and appeared on 60 Minutes. In bailing out the financial system, Bernanke made the bank more influential than it ever had been. In 2010, he was determined to push things further. Bernanke saw Honig's concern as wrong-headed and disarmed them masterfully by personally lobbying the other members of the FOMIC. It eventually became obvious that Honig's no votes were unlikely to sway any of his peers on the FOMIC. His dissents now had a different effect. He was sending a message to the public. He wanted people to understand that what the Fed was about to do something profound, and that someone had fought against it. He wanted to telegraph that the politics of money wasn't just a technical affair involving smart people who solved equations. It was government action that imposed a public policy regime affecting everyone. After Honig was dressed and ready for the meeting, he made his way to the hotel lobby where he would face his fellow FOMIC members before they cast their votes. When the Fed's regional bank presidents came to town in 2010, the bank put them up in the Hotel Fairmont, and in the morning, they gathered in the lobby where they waited to be picked up by one of the most powerful carpools in America. The Fed sent vehicles to ferry them as a group to its headquarters building about 15 minutes away in D.C.'s dense morning traffic. Sometimes the regional bank presidents rode together in a van. At other times, they rode one or two to a town car. There was a deep feeling of collegiality among the bank presidents, and Honig fit with them. His appearance could be described as a standard issue banker. He had a square jaw, a dimpled chin, and blue eyes. He was good looking in a conventional, almost generic way. He had the face of someone that you might expect to see across the desk from you, about to extend to you a very reasonable 30-year home loan. He was tall and dressed conservatively. The cadence of his speech and his vocabulary matched the subdued color and cut of his wardrobe. He unspooled sentences methodically in a measured way, never letting his words race ahead of his intended message. When Honig got agitated, he repeated the phrase "look it" a lot. But that wasn't about as salty as it got. For many years, Honig got along quite well with everyone on the FOMIC. When he came down to the lobby, he could easily make small talk with the other regional bank presidents. They shared a bond that few outsiders could understand. They operated a large part of the American economic machine, and they shouldered a very heavy burden in doing so. They were also, to a person, pretty brilliant people. There was Janet Yellen, for example, president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve. She was arguably one of the most accomplished economists in the country, having served as a Fed economist in the late 1970s before teaching Saints at Harvard, the London School of Economics, and UC Berkeley. She had been chairwoman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors in the late 1990s and was fluent in the complex language of macroeconomics. But she had never lost her Brooklyn accent. She could be blunt as well as charming when talking about what the Fed might do next. Then there was Richard Fisher, the president of the Dallas Fed, who looked every part the investment banker that he'd once been. Fisher slicked back his white hair, wore sharp suits, and spoke in a baroque and grandiloquent way during the FOMIC meetings, mixing poetic metaphors and jokes throughout his long monologues. Just a couple of months prior, Fisher had opened his remarks by saying, "Mr. Chairman, I'll tell a story to frame my comments. 3 Texas AGs applied to be detectives." This was a typical Fisherian opening. There was also Charles Plosser, president of the Philadelphia Fed, a reserved academic, and Charles Evans, the youngest president of the Chicago Fed and a self-described inflation nutter. These were Honig's people. They all spoke the same language. They shared the same burden. Honig had worked around people like this his entire career since joining the Fed in 1937. But his position inside the FOMIC had grown increasingly strained with each no vote that he cast. Honig was pushing himself further and further to the fringe of the Fed's power structure. There were 2 reasons why Honig's dissents were causing so much tension. First had to do with the way the Fed was run. Consensus and unanimous votes had become all important inside the FOMIC. The world needed to have faith that the Fed's leaders knew what they were doing, and that what they were doing was something much more like math than politics. The mighty brains who ruled the FOMIC were portrayed to the public as PhD educated civil servants who were essentially solving complex equations rather than making policy choices. When a FOMIC member dissented, it shattered this illusion. It pointed out that there might be competing points of view, even heated debate, about what path forward the Fed ought to take. Unanimous votes helped the FOMIC keep its power by essentially denying that it had power. It was just a group of smart engineers operating the power plant according to the rule manual. The second reason Honig's dissents caused so much tension was tightly linked to the first. Consensus was even more important at the FOMIC because the decisions it was making were more consequential. America's democratic institutions were increasingly paralyzed, which left more work to be done by its non democratic institutions, like the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve. This reality was literally blaring from TV sets and splashed on the front pages on the morning that Honig went down to the lobby. The Hotel Fairmont offered guests free copies of the New York Times, and on that morning of November 3rd, the Times carried one of those bold type headings across the top of the front page that telegraphs emergency. GOP takes House, the headline read. Below that, in smaller type, it proclaimed setback for Obama and Democrat agenda. Cuomo wins, show of strength by Tea Party. The previous day had been election day across America, the first midterm election of Barack Obama's presidency, a crucial vote that would determine who controlled Congress. Just 2 years prior, voters had hit the change button and hit it hard, giving the Democratic Party control of the White House and both chambers of Congress. Now voters hit the change button again, taking away control of the House of Representatives and crippling the Democrats' control of the Senate by narrowing their majority. This was a rebuke to Obama's administration, but it was also just one in a long string of rebukes against the democratically elected government in Washington. Almost every election was a change election by 2010. Voters threw the bums out, then threw the new bums in. The American electorate seemed motivated primarily by anger and discontent. And this anger found a new form in the conservative Tea Party movement. If the Tea Party had a single animating principle, it was the principle of saying no. The Tea Partiers were dedicated to halting the work of the government entirely. The Times quoted a Tea Party activist stating that her goal was to hold the line at all hazards. It was a shame that America's democratic institutions, like Congress, stopped working at the very moment they were needed most. The global financial crisis of 2008 didn't come out of nowhere. The collapse came after many long years of decay inside an economic system that had stopped working for a majority of Americans. The problems were varied and complex, and they all helped create the conditions for crisis. With indebted workers, powerful banks extended risky loans, and widely overvalued market prices. People were borrowing more money in part because the decline of labor unions had taken away the bargaining power of workers, depressing their wages and degrading their working conditions. Trade deals shifted jobs overseas as a new technology meant fewer workers were wanted. An aging population relied more and more heavily on underfunded government programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, creating huge levels of government debt. The education system was falling behind that of peer nations. Years of deregulation meant that the banking system was dominated by a few titanic firms that specialized in making and selling opaque and risky debt instruments. These were huge challenges facing the nation, and the federal government had not substantially addressed any of them. There were conservative ways to deal with these problems, and there were liberal ways to deal with these problems. But with the election of the Tea Party, Congress was not going to deal with the problems at all. The federal legislative machine had been switched off, beginning an era of stasis and dysfunction. This put a tremendous burden on each member of the FOMIC. On November 3rd, the Federal Reserve became the central driver of American economic policy making. If American voters had just voted to halt government action, they did so at the very moment when the Fed was about to embark on a program of unprecedented activism. This is why the Fed was able to act so quickly. Back in 2008, the Fed had gotten about $1 trillion out the door before Congress was even able to tie its shoes and start debating stimulus bills and bank bailouts. The 12 FOMIC members couldn't ignore that they were charting the course of American economic development. And it was exactly at this historic moment that Thomas Honig decided to embark on his string of dissents. Among the longest of any FOMIC member in history, Honig dissented so frequently that it seemed like he enjoyed it. A columnist at the Wall Street Journal wrote a regular column called The Lone Dissenter, in which he interviewed Honig after each no vote. Honig wasn't just undermining the image of a conscience-driven Fed, he was helping draw attention to the fact this echoed loudly inside the cloistered world of the FOMIC members, who spoke often and who traveled to the same conference and award ceremonies. Honig had been well liked in that world, but now his peers talked to him with unease. They asked if he was unsure he needed to do what he was doing. The relationship between Honig and Chairman Bernanke, though never close, was now adversarial. Years later, when Bernanke wrote his memoir, the book included relatively few mean-spirited comments, and many of them were reserved for Honig. Bernanke painted Honig as a disloyal, obstinate, and maybe even a little unbalanced. When the cars arrived, Honig and the other bank presidents walked outside through the glass doors of the hotel lobby to the half-circle driveway. Sheltered beneath a broad portico where their ride awaited, Honig got in, and the vehicle nosed out of the driveway and into the busy morning traffic. The route from the hotel to the Fed headquarters passed through the Foggy Bottom neighborhood of northwestern Washington, a quiet part of the city that feels far more removed from the Capitol building and the busy streets surrounding the White House. One route to the headquarters passed through Washington Circle, a small park with a statue of America's first president in the middle, riding a horse, leaning back slightly with a sword in his hand, as if preparing to enter the battlefield. As the scenery passed, Honig had a few final minutes to think and to fortify himself for the day. Each member of the Phonik would present an argument during the day-long meeting, and Honig had been working hard on his statement. What was going to happen that day was basically a political debate, and Honig needed to carefully marshal his facts. Even the basic politics of the Federal Reserve are confusing to outsiders. In the broader American world, the battle lines of political argument were relatively clear. You had your conservatives who wanted to limit government reach, and you had your liberals who wanted to expand government reach. The angry debates that played out on the cable news each night tended to flow from these two broad theories of government. But the politics of the Fed were scrambled, and it didn't make a lot of sense within this broader framework. The basic tensions within the Fed was described with language that had been borrowed from the world of foreign policy, using the terminology of hawks and doves. In foreign policy, it was the hawks who advocated for aggressive military intervention, and it was the doves who pushed against aggressive intervention by supporting diplomacy. Curiously, these terms were revised when applied to the Fed, and it was the doves inside the Fed who argued for the more aggressive intervention, and it was the hawks who tried to limit the Fed's reach. The debate between hawks and doves at the Fed was usually talked about in terms of inflation, that dangerous state of affairs when prices rise quickly and the value of a currency falls. If the Fed is seen as a team of nuclear engineers who supervise economic growth, then inflation is seen as the meltdown to be avoided at all costs. The last time inflation hit America was in the 1970s, and it was remembered as a chaotic time when prices for everything from meat to gasoline to houses were rising uncontrollably. Central banks caused inflation when they kept interest rates too low for too long. Hawks hated inflation and therefore wanted to keep interest rates higher and limit the Fed's reach. Doves were less afraid of inflation and therefore more willing to print lots of money. It is unclear exactly who started the hawk and dove motive inside the Fed, but it stuck. Janet Yellen, for example, was often described as dovish because she supported low interest rates and more intervention. Tom Honig and Richard Fisher, in contrast, were described as hawkish because they sought to raise interest rates and limit the Fed's reach into markets. Needless to say, among the public, the doves got better press. Who could take issue with a dove? The theory seemed to be that doves were compassionate and wanted to help the economy and working people, while hawks were harsh and severe and wanted to stop the Fed from helping people. Honig's actions during 2010 had turned him into the Fomex ultra hawk. It even turned him into something worse. In economic terms, he was seen as a type of prehistoric brute, something economists called a melanist, a term that refers to Andrew Mellon, who was Secretary of the Treasury when the Depression began. There aren't many actual villains in the world of economics, but Mellon is one of them. Mellon is famous for one thing: being heartless and delusional. This reputation came from a single piece of advice that he gave President Herbert Hoover as the markets collapsed. Mellon told Hoover to let the fire burn, let the people go broke. He believed the crash was a type of moral cleansing that was necessary to clear the way for a better economy in the future. Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. Mellon is reported to have told Hoover the reason this advice was delusional as well as heartless was that Mellon's economic theory was mistaken. It wasn't cleansing to liquidate the farmers and the stocks. The liquidation created a downward cycle of unemployment, weak spending, and slow growth that only grew harder to reverse the longer it lasted. By urging Hoover to liquidate so much value, Mellon liquidated years of future economic growth. It seemed inconceivable that someone could push Mellon's views in 2010, and it appeared that this was exactly what Honig was trying to do. The Fed was trying to help. It was trying to boost economic growth. The Fed was trying to be dovish by voting against these plans. Honig was apparently trying to keep the Fed on the sideline as people suffered under a 9.6% unemployment rate. Honig, the extreme hawk, the Melanist, was out of step with the times. This was, in fact, the reputation that solidified around Thomas Honig over time. Years after his string of dissents, a liberal financial reporter in New York, when asked about Honig, immediately responded, "Yeah, he's a crank." Around the same time, at a cocktail party in Washington, D.C., an economist with the American Enterprise Institute, the conservative think tank, immediately said about Honig he was wrong. Honig's concerns were universally remembered as being concerns over inflation, concerns that proved to be unwarranted because inflation never arrived. Over the years, the story about Honig became that of a misplaced Old Testament figure who had somehow wandered onto the modern economic landscape, clinging on to outdated scripture and frantically warning about inflation, more inflation, and even hyperinflation. The historical record shows that this narrative is entirely wrong. Honig didn't dissent because he was worried about inflation. He was also no Melanist. During the global financial crisis, Honig voted repeatedly to take emergency actions that were both far-reaching and unprecedented. He believed in the Fed's role as a crisis responder that could flood the banking sector with money in times of panic. He believed in robust money printing policies when banks were in trouble. Honig only began dissenting in 2010 when it appeared that the Federal Reserve was committed to keeping the American money supply at the zero bound. A review of Honig's comments during the 2010 FOMIC meeting, the transcripts of which become public 5 years after the fact, along with his speech and interviews at that time, show that he rarely mentioned inflation at all. Honig warned about quite different things, and his warnings turned out to be precedent. But his warnings were also very hard to understand for people who didn't closely follow the politics of money. Honig, for instance, liked to talk a lot about something called the allocative effect of keeping interest rates at the zero bound. The allocative effect wasn't something that people debated at the barber shop, but it was something that affected everyone. Honig was talking about the allocation of money and the ways in which the Fed shifted money from one part of the economy to another. He was pointing out that the Fed's policies did a lot more than just affect overall economic growth. The Fed's policies shifted money between the rich and the poor, and they encouraged or discouraged things like Wall Street speculation that could lead to ruinous financial crashes. This whole way of talking about the Fed undermined the very construct of hawks versus doves. He was pointing to the fact that the Fed could cause meltdowns that had nothing to do with the price of inflation. Honig didn't just say these things behind the closed doors of FOMIC meetings. In May 2010, he laid out his views and explained his dissents in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. Monetary policy has to be more than just targeting inflation. It is a more powerful tool than that. It is also an allocative policy, as we have learned, Honig said. When Honig talked about allocative effects, he was describing how 0% interest rates created winners and losers. When interest rates hit zero, the money becomes cheap. It pushes banks to make riskier loans. That's because the banks can't earn a profit by saving money, as they might be able to do in a world where interest rates are higher, like at, say, 4%. In a 4% world, a bank can earn a decent return by stashing its money in ultra-safe investments like government treasury bonds, which would pay the bank 4% for the loan. In a 0% world, things are different. A bank earns much closer to nothing for stashing its money in an ultra-safe bond. This pushes the bank to search for earnings out there in the risky wilderness. A riskier loan might pay a higher interest rate, or a higher yield, as the bankers call it. When banks start hunting for yield, they are moving their cash further out on the yield curve, as they say, into the riskier investments. Life at the zero bounds pushes banks way down the yield curve. What does a bank have to lose? A risky bet beats nothing. And this isn't just a side effect of keeping rates at zero. That's the whole point, Honig explained many years later. The point was to get people willing to take greater risk to get the economy started again. But it also allocates resources. It allocates where that money goes. Honig was worried about what would happen when the Fed pushed all that money from safe investments out into risky investments. When cash is pushed out onto the yield curve, It leads to the second big problem that Honig warned about in 2010, something called an asset bubble. The housing market that collapsed in 2008 was an asset bubble. The dot-com stock market crash of 2000 was the bursting of an asset bubble. When an asset bubble crashed, the general public tended to blame the people at the scene of the disaster, who were inevitably greedy Wall Street types. It was the short sighted broker who bid up the stock market, or the dishonest mortgage lenders who fueled the housing boom. But Honig had sat down on the FOMIC during both of these asset bubbles and the following crashes, and he seen firsthand the Fed's vital role in creating them. Honig was worried in November 2010 that the Fed was repeating this mistake. Just a few months earlier, at the August FOMIC meeting, Honig's frustrations seemed to boil over. He said something that most Fed officials never acknowledged, at least in public. The central bank hadn't just rescued the economy from the crash of 2008. The Fed bore a great deal of responsibility for it. The financial and economic shocks we've experienced did not just come out of nowhere, he said. They followed years of low interest rates, high and increasing leverage, and overly lax financial supervision as prescribed by both Democratic and Republican administrations. He was explaining his dissent at that meeting and warning that the Fed might be making the same mistakes that led to 2008. The continued use of zero interest rate will only add the risk to the longer run out. Look, he said, Honig lost that fight and all the other fights in 2010. The Fed didn't just keep rates pegged at the zero bound, but was now voting on the plan to go below the zero bound. With quantitative easing, Honig had fought against quantitative easing for months, and today he would lose that fight as well. Honig's ride continued south toward the Fed's headquarters, which were located in the Mariner Eccles building. The Eccles building was down on the quiet side of the mall, near the opposite end from the Capitol Dome. The building was modest by the standards of Washington. It wasn't very imposing. It was barely notable. In fact, next to the museums and trade buildings that populated the mall, the Eccles building had a bright white marble facade and rectangular columns as pristine as an engraving on a dollar bill. Neat lines, sharp angles, and quiet authority. The cars carrying the regional bank's presidents were guided to a side entrance of the building, where they drove into a private basement lot. The passengers got out and walked down a hallway into the building itself, taking an elevator up to the second floor, where Honig and other bank presidents made their way to the boardroom. The decor inside the Eccles is what you would get if a big bank and a museum had a child. The hushed, carpeted hallways were lined with fine art. The offices alongside them were large and well appointed. The bathroom was the most famous feature of the Eccles building, and the most famous feature of the boardroom was the enormous ovoid table at its center, a gleaming slat of polished wood that seemed to go on forever. The FOMIC members gathered around this table when they debated. An ornate, gilded chandelier hung directly above the table for lighting. There was a yawning fireplace framed by a large mantelpiece on one side of the room. On the opposite side were rows of chairs where staffers assembled and sat during the meeting, offering presentations when called upon. Tom Honig took his seat as the FOMIC members made small talk and found their places. Honig was first joined this table. As a voting member of the FOMIC, when the legendary Alan Greenspan presided as chairman of the Fed. But Honig's experience at the central bank went back even further than that. He had worked at the Fed under the leadership of 5 chairmen, starting with Arthur Burns back in the 1970s and including the legendary tenure of Paul Volcker, who raised interest rates to the double digits in the early 1980s to beat inflation, causing a brutal recession in the bargain. There had never been anything like a peaceful, stable period at the Fed. Things were always changing, and one crisis led to another, but there had also never been a period quite like the one under Greenspan's successor, Ben Bernanke, who changed everything. All right, we'll go ahead and leave off there, and we will pick up on page 22 in the next video. So if you have any questions or comments or just concerns or any of that, please leave a comment in the comment section, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.